October 29th, 1929. The New York Stock Exchange is hemorrhaging. Brokers spread across marble floors. Phones scream. $12 billion evaporate in a single afternoon. Not from bombs, not from bullets, from a ledger, a balance sheet turned weapon. Everyone remembers World War II as a story of tanks, generals, and ideology. They give you Hitler's madness, Churchill's speeches, and the maps. They never show you the spreadsheet. Because here is the truth history books quietly bury. World War II did not begin in 1939. It began in 1919, when the Treaty of Versailles handed Germany a bill for 132 billion gold marks. That is roughly $400 billion in today's money. Germany was financially executed before anyone fired a shot. It was insolvency dressed up as peace. Every world war in human history started not with a declaration of war, but with a declaration of bankruptcy. That is not a metaphor. That is a forensic fact. And right now, in early 2026, every financial warning sign that preceded the last two global catastrophes is flashing simultaneously. Not one of them, not three of them, all of them. This is not a video about missiles and warships. Once you see the ledger underneath the headlines, you cannot unsee it. And once you see it, you will understand exactly how close we are. Let us start not at the beginning of the crisis. At the beginning of the illusion, picture July 1944, Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. 630 delegates from 44 nations gather at the Mount Washington Hotel. The war is not even over yet. The decision they make is extraordinary. Every currency on earth will be pegged to the U.S. dollar. The dollar itself will be backed by gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. America is sitting on 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. So America becomes, for all practical purposes, the financial anchor of the planet. Think about the scale of that. One nation, one currency, one ledger to rule them all. For 25 years, the system works magnificently. Percent annually through the 1950s and 1960s. The middle class swells like a tide, lifting all boats. The dollar flows everywhere. It oils every trade deal, every oil contract, every armed sale on the planet. The world marvels at the American century. Hollywood sells the dream. Washington preaches freedom and prosperity. But beneath the surface, the foundation was rotting. The rot begins quietly, as it always does. The Vietnam War costs the United States $843 billion in modern terms. President Johnson simultaneously launches the Great Society, spending hundreds of billions on domestic welfare. You cannot fight a land war in Asia and rebuild domestic infrastructure without printing money. By 1971, foreign governments holding dollars start doing the math. They realize America no longer has enough gold to back all the dollars it has printed. France, under de Gaulle, leads the charge. French officials load gold onto ships and begin redeeming dollars at the Federal Reserve. The run on Fort Knox begins. On August 15, 1971, President Nixon goes on television. In 18 minutes, he commits the most consequential economic act of the 20th century. He cuts the dollars linked to gold entirely. No more convertibility. The dollar is now backed by nothing but a promise. It is called the Nixon shock. Nixon called it temporary. It has been 54 years. It is still in place. This is where the addiction begins. This is where the trap is set. Once you detach money from a physical constraint, debt becomes the drug. And the United States, the issuer of the world's reserve currency, becomes the world's most powerful addict. Here's how the addiction works. The U.S. prints dollars. Other nations must hold dollars to buy oil because since 1974, Saudi Arabia has agreed to price all oil exclusively in dollars. This arrangement, brokered by Henry Kissinger, is called the petrodollar system. It is the single most important financial agreement most people have never heard of. Therefore, every nation must sell goods to America to earn those dollars. America, in return, simply prints more. It is the most elegant debt machine ever constructed. It is also the most catastrophic. The antagonist here is not a general or a president. The antagonist is the system itself, the invisible creditor at every negotiating table, the interest rate, the bond market, the $315 trillion mountain of global debt that has accumulated since Nixon closed the gold window. Let that number settle. $315 trillion. That is more than 3 times the annual economic output of every nation on Earth combined. This is the economic trap. And right now, every major power on Earth is caught inside it. Watch how the descent unfolds. In 2022, the United States weaponizes the dollar in a way it has never done before. When Russia invades Ukraine, Washington freezes $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves held in Western institutions. Not sanctions, not tariffs. Outright seizure of a sovereign nation's savings. The message to every other central bank is terrifying. If your dollars are in Western accounts, they are not your dollars. They are a hostage. Saudi Arabia holds hundreds of billions more. Every one of those nations watches what happens to Moscow's reserves and begins a quiet, methodical exit. This is called de-dollarization. It begins not with a bang, but with a whisper. The petrodollar's 70-year monopoly develops its first crack. By 2024, the expanded BRICS bloc, now including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, and Ethiopia, represents 45% of the world's population and begins formal talks on a reserve currency alternative to the dollar. The numbers tell the story. Global central bank gold purchases hit a record 1,136 tons in 2022. Gold shatters $3,000 per ounce in early 2025. Central banks are not buying gold because they love jewelry. They are buying gold because they no longer trust paper. Now, look at what happens to nations that cannot pay. By 2024, 44 countries are in some form of debt distress. Sri Lanka collapses in 2022. Hospitals go dark. Farmers cannot plant because there is no diesel. Zambia defaults. Pakistan survives only on a $3 billion emergency IMF injection. These are not isolated incidents. They are previews. Argentina has defaulted 9 times in its national history. 9 times. Each default follows the same brutal sequence. The peso collapses. Inflation explodes. The middle class is wiped out. Poverty rates double within 18 months. And each time, ordinary people pay for decisions made in boardrooms they were never invited into. Lebanon has already lived this movie. By 2019, government debt reaches 170% of GDP. Banks freeze deposits. Citizens cannot withdraw their own savings. The Lebanese pound loses 90% of its value in 18 months. A professional who saved $50,000 their entire life wakes up holding the equivalent of 5,000. The savings did not disappear. They were liquidated by a balance sheet. Now scale it. Scale it to a United States carrying $36 trillion in federal debt as of early 2026, where interest payments exceed $1 trillion per year, more than the entire defense budget, where America now spends more servicing its debt than funding Medicare. Scale it to Europe, where France's debt to GDP ratio exceeds 112% and Italy sits at 137%. Scale it to China, where Evergrande collapses under $300 billion in liabilities, and local government financing vehicles carry an estimated $9 trillion in hidden obligations. The entire global financial architecture is not stressed. It is cracking through to the foundation. And when the foundation cracks at this scale, the social consequences are not abstract. They are breadlines. They are heating systems that go dark in winter. They are young men with no economic future, and a government handing them a rifle as a substitute debt. Now, here is where history becomes prophecy. There is a document, not a military treaty, not a declaration of war. A financial memo produced by the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland in 2023. The BIS is the central bank of central banks, older than the United Nations, more secretive than any intelligence agency. The BIS report concludes that the world has entered what it calls a debt trap. Central banks can no longer raise interest rates without triggering sovereign debt crises across multiple countries simultaneously. But they cannot lower rates without reigniting inflation. They are foreclosed from moving in either direction. In plain language, the global financial system is locked. It has no exit. The house has been mortgaged to the walls. The creditors have lined up, and the payment is due. This is the smoking gun. A foreclosure notice written in the polished language of economists who understand exactly what they are describing. When governments cannot borrow more and cannot print without destroying their currency, they look for another option. They look for resources. They look for territory. They look for an enemy. Follow the money, and you see the military movements in their true light. The U.S. buildup near Venezuela is not about democracy. In a world where the petrodollar system is fracturing, controlling Venezuelan oil is not foreign policy. It is financial survival. NATO's eastern posture is not purely about Russian aggression. Ukraine controls 25% of the world's fertile black soil, plus vast deposits of lithium, titanium, and rare earth minerals. The war in Ukraine is, at its economic core, a resource war fought over the physical inputs of the next industrial era. China's pressure on Taiwan is not ideological. Taiwan manufactures over 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors. TSMC chips power everything from iPhones to F-35 fighters. Whoever controls Taiwan controls the nervous system of the global technology economy. That is not politics. That is accounting. Iran's nuclear standoff plays out against Iranian oil sanctions, costing Tehran an estimated $200 billion in lost revenue since 2018. A nation bled white by economic isolation does not behave rationally. A cornered debtor is the most dangerous creature in finance. Every flashpoint on the news is a balance sheet argument dressed in camouflage. And here is the detail that should stop you cold. Space. The GPS jamming warnings issued by the FAA over the Caribbean. The strange satellite maneuvers logged near Western spy assets. The Starlink blackout windows that align suspiciously with military exercises. Space warfare is not science fiction. It is the financial choke point of modern civilization. Knock out satellite navigation and you knock out supply chain coordination, banking transactions, military targeting, and emergency communications simultaneously. It is the most cost-effective insolvency operation ever devised. In March 2025, sweeping U.S. tariffs hit 185 countries. A global trading system built over 70 years on free trade and dollar dominance receives the most aggressive shock in its history. The IMF revises its global growth forecast downward almost immediately. The World Bank warns of rising food insecurity across 60 developing nations. Supply chains fracture. Shipping costs from Shanghai to Los Angeles spike by 340%. Rare earth exports from China are restricted. Auto manufacturers from Germany to Japan close plants. The economic infrastructure of the post-war world is being dismantled in real time. This is where the phrase becomes most chilling. Sovereignty is solvency. A nation that cannot pay its bills is not truly sovereign. It is a debtor waiting for creditors to make decisions on its behalf. Greece learned this in 2010, when Greece could no longer service its €330 billion debt. The EU and IMF did not send aid, they sent auditors. They demanded pension cuts, wage reductions, and asset sales. Greece sold its ports, its airports, its utilities to foreign buyers, not because Greeks voted for it, because the balance sheet demanded it. Now transpose that dynamic to a nuclear-armed state, to a permanent UN Security Council member, to a country with hypersonic missiles and a history of using force to reclaim national pride after economic humiliation. This is not hypothetical. History has already performed this script. Germany in 1933 was a nation crushed by war debt and the Great Depression. Unemployment stood at 30%. The Weimar Republic had printed money so desperately that people burned banknotes for heat because wood cost more. Into that economic void stepped a man with an answer that was simple, violent, and catastrophically wrong. The sequence is always the same. Economic collapse, political extremism, military mobilization, war. We are watching Act 1 and Act 2 unfold across multiple continents simultaneously. Europe reopening Cold War bunkers is not paranoia. It is a government acknowledging that the economic glue preventing conflict for 80 years is dissolving. When France reintroduces national service, when Germany registers 18-year-olds for military duty, when Poland expands defense spending to 5% of GDP, these governments are not warmongers. They are reading the balance sheet and preparing accordingly. Cyber attacks on water systems and power grids are not random criminal activity. They are the advanced work of financial warfare. Destroy a nation's infrastructure, and you destroy its economic capacity. A country that cannot power its factories or process its food cannot produce the GDP to service its debt. Infrastructure attacks are, in economic terms, targeted insolvency operations. GPS jamming over the Caribbean, the Baltic, the South China Sea collapses trade in real time. Lloyd's of London began issuing war risk surcharges for Red Sea transits in late 2023 that added 30 to 40% to shipping costs overnight. Trade becomes too expensive, supply chains collapse, shelves empty, and economically desperate populations become politically combustible. When a government converts auto factories to tank production, it is making an accounting decision, not a military one. War production is the oldest economic stimulus in history. Roosevelt ended the Great Depression through wartime manufacturing. GDP growth from 1940 to 1944 averaged over 17% annually. Unemployment dropped from 14.6% to 1.2%. War is grotesquely the ultimate stimulus package. When central banks freeze payments and governments ration commodities, they are managing a balance sheet that has already reached de facto insolvency. Rationing is what happens when debt is so large the economy cannot pay both the soldiers and the civilians. The final hours will feel strangely calm. Markets will not crash. They will be frozen, because a crashed market can recover. A frozen market is a controlled demolition. Credit cards will stop working not from a hack, but by deliberate administrative act. Roads will empty of civilian traffic and fill with military convoys because the fuel allocation has shifted. Grocery shelves will empty not from panic buying, but because supply chains have been quietly rerouted to feed the mobilization. And then the attack comes, real, unmistakable, and everyone asks how it happened so suddenly. It did not happen suddenly. It was written in the ledger years before. We have watched this film twice already. We watched it in 1914, when the gold standard collapsed under war financing. We watched it in 1939, when the Great Depression shattered the economic rationale for peace. We are watching the opening scenes of the third act now, as the dollar-denominated global order built at Bretton Woods begins its final disintegration. The warning signs are not in military deployments. They are in interest rate decisions. They are in gold purchases. They are in currency swap agreements. They are in BI's quarterly reports that nobody reads until it is too late. History does not repeat, but it does compound interest. When social media accounts begin disappearing, when dissenting voices are silenced, not for spam but for national security reasons, recognize what that is. It is capital control for the information economy.